Session of Independent School District 535 School Board is called to order at 5:30 p.m. Tuesday, April 19th, 2022, in room 137 of the Edison Building. This session is being held for the sole purpose of allowing those who want to address the board about field trip fees the opportunity to do so, as required by Minnesota statute. We will convene the regular board meeting immediately after adjourning this session and will include the Pledge of Allegiance at that time. Present at this session are school board members, Superintendent Ken Pickell, a non-voting ex officio member, and Assistant Board Clerk Michelle Severson. Ms. Severson, will you please call the roll?
Thank you. Director Amundson.
Here.
Clerk Barlow.
Here.
Director Garcia.
Here.
Treasurer McLaughlin.
Here.
Chair Marvin.
Here.
Vice Chair Nathan.
Here.
Director Workman.
Here.
Thank you.
2.0 approval of agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Move approval. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The agenda is approved. 4.02, this is a public hearing on field trip fees. Are there any Rochester School District residents here who wish to speak to the proposed field trip fees? Seeing none, we are adjourned at 5:31. That's how we do a meeting. This regular meeting of Independent School District 535 School Board is called to order at 5:32 p.m. Tuesday, April 19th, 2022, in room 137 of the Edison Building. Interested members of the public are welcome and encouraged to view this meeting remotely at youtube.com/ISD535, where the live stream video may be found. This board acknowledges that this site and all RPS sites are situated on the ancestral land of the Dakota people, and we honor the Dakota nations and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. That sentence is from our district's core beliefs. It is the foundation of our equity policy, which is the foundation for the way this district works. The second equity core belief reads, we believe equity is a lens through which all decisions should be made. And by the way, our equity beliefs are posted at the back of the boardroom. Equity, and this is important for all of us to understand, means that when we make decisions, we try to be really thoughtful about how changing something will not disadvantage any group of students, but will provide access and resources so that all voices will be heard and all students will have the opportunity to be successful. And we believe strongly that's what every public education institution should be about. Everybody's child. Present at this meeting are school board members, Superintendent Ken Pickell, a non-voting ex officio member, and Assistant School Board Clerk, Ms. Michelle Severson. Board members, you've had a chance to practice. Ms. Severson, will you please call the roll again?
Thank you. Director Amundson.
Still here.
Clerk Barlow.
Here.
Director Garcia.
Here.
Treasurer McLaughlin.
Here.
Chair Marvin.
Here.
Vice Chair Nathan.
Here.
Director Workman.
Here.
Thank you.
At this time, we provide an opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Move approval. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Agenda is approved. We have no comments to the board at this time, Ms. Severson?
No comments.
Okay. 4.02, board member committee updates. Any board members have information they'd like to share about committee work that they have done? Yes, Ms. Amundson.
Director Workman and I successfully presented School Board Academy, which was a 3 to 4 total hours, optional 4th hour, opportunity to learn about the roles, responsibilities, and details running for school board. And I should have counted how many people that attended, but it was a really wonderful group, and I see some of them in the audience tonight.
Great.
And I think we will have a really solid group of people who are interested in running for school board, filing for school board in May.
Excellent, thank you.
Anything to add, Julie?
No.
Other reports? I have,
Go ahead.
go ahead, no, you go ahead.
I have a report from Youth Commission.
Okay.
And I don't often report on this because the students are constantly working on different projects that are fabulous in our community. But the longtime coordinator of the Rochester Olmsted Youth Commission, Mary Gorfine, is going to be retiring. So if you see her, thank her for her years and years, decades really, of service working with youth.
When is that effective?
Now, pretty much. I mean, I think the last meeting is May or June, but Mary's on medical leave right now, so it's hard to say what's going to happen. So.
And I have a quick report from the Family and Community Engagement Committee, to which I belong. They began the meeting with a question for board members and for all of you out there. Do you know who first came up with the idea for daylight savings time?
Well, is it Benjamin Franklin?
Who? No. But thanks for trying. It was Benjamin Franklin. Oh, you say you know it, but you didn't raise your hand.
I probably
I
learned
heard
from
it
you.
from here. She
Okay.
said it.
Anyway, it was Benjamin Franklin, although it wasn't instituted until the end of the Second World War. I didn't know that either. And now we may not have it anymore. And we'll take a poll later about who's going to miss it. Every month at the meeting that they have, I mean, this a department does a huge amount of outreach to our families and our students. They're having a math and science night for English language learner families. They talked about a number of other activities. They have a really well-done website where they talk about community opportunities. They also had some information about learning at home. And the question is, who is responsible for learning? And the answer is sort of everyone. But they talked about how parents can really help their kids with learning, even if they don't have deep content knowledge in any particular area, simply by posing questions to their kids and then letting their children problem solve, not just giving them the answer, but let children work through a solution. It may not be the same one that the parents would come up with, but that's a really powerful tool that parents can use to help their kids learn at home. I'd also like to announce that April 27th is Administrative Professionals Day, and on that day we will be acknowledging two of our very important administrative professionals, Ms. Michelle Severson, who is the board's assistant clerk, and Lori Sam, who is in the superintendent's office.
She is the superintendent, really.
We don't let people know that. But without both of these women, our work would be nearly impossible. So we thank them now publicly, and we will thank you next week privately. You're pointing.
I'm just telling Dr. Pickell that his microphone is not close to his mouth.
Oh,
Thank you.
Just in case you didn't
okay,
know.
we will move on to the consent agenda. Are there any items to be removed for separate consideration? Hearing none.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. 6.01, Summer of Discovery. This is a focus topic. Dr. Pickell.
Dr. Marvin and directors of the board, it may seem distant now, especially given the weather out today, but summer is coming.
Yeah.
And believe it, it will happen. And we have had a team that has been planning for it for quite a while. When I got to Rochester last July 1, I was thrilled to go around with Amy Ike, our executive director of community education and communications, to visit the sites. And what I found Rochester Public Schools had done was completely flip the switch on what many summer school programs around the country have unfortunately become, which is fairly passive, almost drill and kill efforts to make up lost academic ground. Now, academic ground is critical, but what we did last summer with what we called Summer of Discovery was invest in enrichment, invest in creativity, higher order thinking skills, and reading and math. And so we are building on that success of last summer under Amy's leadership with Summer of Discovery 2. This is a key part of our effort to help young people make up for unfinished learning, which is the term I prefer to learning loss, that has happened during the pandemic. And so Amy's had a team that has been out working on that effort, and so we thought it was a good time to give the board and the community an update. If you are out there and you are an RPS parenting adult or anyone who knows young people, please consider enrolling them in Summer of Discovery, because it's a fantastic program and it's going to get even better in the summer ahead. So Amy.
Thank you. We bring you an update tonight. I'd like to introduce Linda Rood from Elton Hills Elementary, Natalia Benjamin from Century High School, who will join me in some of the presentation. My job is to give you a little bit of context at the beginning, and then we really want you to hear from our teacher leaders who have helped push this innovation forward. So just a reminder of some of the things that we attempted to do in our first year, and that this is a 3-year innovation project. So we identified our 4 essential learning areas. We focused on small class size for relationship building. We enabled our staff to have high engagement, hands-on environments through creative planning as well as supplies and support. We wanted students to have experiences that would really build the context for future learning. That's often a gap among students, and so this was a way to level the playing field, so to speak. We embedded staff experts in mental health, special education, and English learning or language growth, along with our classroom teachers, to make sure that we were supporting all the needs of our students. We set a goal of creating an identity-affirming culture through our materials, our experiences, and we'll talk about that tonight as well as one of our growth areas for this next year. We worked on some initial community partnerships last year. We're expanding those again this year to be able to extend our learning even beyond what our own staff can provide. And then a major component of this innovation effort was teacher leadership in that planning and implementation. So a few quick numbers. As you know, this is the 3rd pandemic-affected school year. It's hard to say that. Time goes fast, but if you really think about it, this started 3 years ago in March, and we see the effects on a daily basis. So keeping that in mind, this is our 2nd year of summer redesign, and again, a 3-year project. 4 essential learning areas, you heard that. This summer, we will have 8 elementary sites, 3 middle school sites. We're combining our 3 comprehensive high schools into 1 at Mayo High School this summer. Part of that is due to the John Marshall construction this year, but also some discussion with our teacher leaders about how they wanted to address that, and it was their idea to consolidate and try that model and see if there were some advantages to consolidating. And then the ALC will also have its program as well, which is extremely strong. So 18 to 22 days per site, depending on the level, elementary, middle, or high school. I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but we were selected as one of 44 districts nationwide to participate in the Wallace Foundation District Summer Learning Network, which is all about this type of innovation. And we get a lot of benefit from being a part of that. One is access to some of the documents that I put into board docs for you to take a look at, along with many others. And then we also get to hear lots from other districts about what they're doing. We recently heard we did get some additional COVID-related money from the state to help this summer, so that extends the dollars that have been assigned out of the out-of-school time piece of the federal COVID money. This is still federal money, but it came through the state of Minnesota. So that was good news. That extends our funding out hopefully another year. And then just some of the continuous improvement that's going on in year 2. So one of the goals was to operationalize the learnings that we had in year 1. So we were continuously taking notes last year on what was working, what we wanted to change. Natalia agreed to do an assessment of our multilingual learner experience, and so she'll talk about that tonight. So really putting those into action this year, and we've already started the list for year 3. So we will have more learnings. We really want summer to be an incubator of the types of innovation that we want to spill into the school year. So we're thinking a lot about what are the pieces of curriculum we'd like to try, what are the approaches, what are the relationship building techniques, things like that, that can make our school year processes better. We are specifically working on improving the experience for our multilingual or EL learners. We have a small team working on some professional development around that and around creating an identity-affirming culture to try and move that work forward as well. This year we're working with an assessment team to try and build that assessment question, how will we know that we had an impact, right into the planning process. That will also be a multi-year effort, but trying to be more planful about that this year. Excuse me. We are trying to evolve our family and community partnership approaches. We began some of that last year. Through the Wallace Foundation, we were able to bring in a $5,000 grant for CERT, the Community Engagement Response Team, to help us engage parents in the planning process. And so they will be focused on engaging our African American parents with us in the content and approaches for summer learning. And then we're still working with our internal emotional wellness group in the district to keep on building the supports for well-being and social emotional learning. And finally, our last area of work is an 8th to 9th grade transition opportunity, partnering with our 21st Century Grant funding source as well. So without further ado, I'm going to have you hear some of the great things that are happening with our teacher leaders. We had 2 folks who unfortunately had to decline tonight after we had posted. So you also see Rhonda Arafat's name on there. She is working closely with Natalia on the improving the experience of multilingual learners. And then Sarah Louise Henry and I are working on the identity affirming culture as well. And just last night she learned she was not able to be here, so she sends her apologies. So I think we'll start with Natalia, and then after that we'll go to Linda.
So like Amy said, I had an opportunity to assess the experience of multilingual learners last year, and I was able to interview the teacher leaders for the sites and then the EL teachers at the sites. So to be able to see what they were working on, how the service models were employed at each level. And I was able to write a report for Amy, and we found a lot of great things. The small teacher to student ratio was great for building relationships and really being able to meet the students' needs. And then the piece of experiential learning was also a great asset for last year's program. And then there were 3 areas that I wrote some recommendations. One was related to communication with our multilingual families, just to improve the registration process, as well as communication throughout the summer. And then the second one had to do with academics, to be able to embed language supports throughout the day, rather than having to do pull-out sessions, and being able to provide some professional development for our teachers so that they would have those strategies more readily available for them to use. And then the last one was related to the collaboration between the EL program and then the different sites, because they're not always together. And so just to find ways that the students would be included within the sites where they were having those experiences. And so the work that Rhonda and I are doing this year is focused on the academic skills and how to embed the language supports through the planning process, so that as we go to implementation in the summer, those are already in place for students to come and be more included throughout their day. So we're looking at a lesson template that will have those, and then sort of like a menu of choices so that staff have some strategies that are easy to implement as they implement their lessons. And then the second piece was with the training of SIOP strategies, so specific language strategies that would help support students to increase their comprehension when it comes to the content and just also their performance when it comes to academics. That's all I have.
So when we look at continuous improvement, of course, we ask the person who's taught it for 100 years. Not quite 100, but over 35. And I can tell you that this past year has been remarkable. Summer school has ebbed and flowed with funding. There were years that we had smaller class sizes. We had some curriculum and some supplies. But over the last 20 years, it has been little or nothing. Teachers were paid 8 to noon. Even though students showed up at 7:30 and were often there till 12:30, 1 o'clock. So teachers just worked that time. There was no curriculum. So teachers created their own curriculum and little or no supply budget within the last 10 years, I would say. So it came out of what was left over at the schools and out of teacher pocket, right? This year was remarkable. Amy and her team listened to what was needed to make a quality program, and that's what they delivered. There was extra support time given to teachers to plan great curriculum for kids. There was planning time every day put in so that they could reassess what was taught, what would work better, how they could improve what was going on. There was a wonderful supply budget so that teachers could plan engaging, hands-on things that the students needed to learn without having to spend as much out of their own pockets. And I think that it really showed not only in the excitement and the attendance of students coming back day after day and wanting to be there, but I think the teachers also felt like they were being honored and respected for the things that they were doing. So this year, when we put out Who Wants to Teach, we had a record number of teachers offering to teach summer school, which I think speaks to that right there. Being a teacher at Elton Hills, I got to hear the kids talk to each other when the letters started coming out. Oh, you have to do this. This was so fun. We did all these things, and they started listing the things that they had done. But beyond that, even being in the classroom setting, kids were referring back to, remember when we did this? Or, oh yeah, we did that at summer school. Or, I saw that. And it's those connections that the kids were making throughout the whole year that were so beneficial. A lot of the students, particularly at Elton Hills, but I think a lot of our EL population don't have those extra experiential connections that many students have. And this just gave them that enrichment that they needed to make that understanding of what other kids are talking about. They were understanding. We did field trips to the zoos. We went to Whitewater and spent the day. We had guest speakers. We had a baker come in from Hy-Vee and show the kids how to decorate cakes. And then each kid got to decorate and use, decorating tools and talked about the education and the things that she needed. We did mystery things, and we had magician come in. And so the possibilities are unlimited, and I think the staff and the students are excited to learn. The kids don't even know that they're always learning, but that's the best part, I think, is that we're learning together.
Do you have any questions for these two before I wrap us up?
Excellent presentation, thank you. In terms of the continuous improvement, actually, let me hold that for a moment. Is summer discovery mandatory, optional? I know in years past, summer school, well, you need to do this because credit recovery. So can you perhaps share how one, well, not necessarily qualifies, but how one could participate in summer discovery?
Sure. Because we have modeled it from the targeted services funding source that we typically use for summer school, there are 13, I think, items in state law that qualify a student for summer learning. And so we've used those as a guide to try and identify students who would most benefit from the experience. So the students are invited by their school, and a number of resources are involved in helping families understand sort of what they're signing up for if they do come. I think one of the things we heard last year was instead of having to do summer school, it shifted a little to, can I come back for a second session? I only signed up for June, but I'm having fun and I want to come back. And so we've, I think, gotten kind of past that have to that you mentioned. But it is still a referral process at this point. The concern I think that we have, there is a desire to open it wide to anyone who would like to come. The concern is whether we can staff that at this point. And last year we had just enough teachers. I'm encouraged to hear we have a record number at Elton Hills. I know I saw 23 right off the bat, very early in the application. So 23 teachers who wanted to work summer, which is incredible at a small school. But I think that's still our concern, is whether we could serve the number who would come if we just opened it wide. So there's still conversation about how do we get there. We're just not there yet.
Thank you. And then, Linda, I think you had mentioned possible takeaways in terms of curriculum development. Are any of those things that are being modeled through Summer of Discovery actually instituted during the regular school year, or are there opportunities to take from what you're learning and experiencing, the innovation that is occurring? Can you transfer that into the
Are you talking
classroom?
students or staff? Staff transfer?
Staff, yes.
Well, certainly, I think that most of the teachers that I can speak to that are from Elton Hills, Churchill, Hoover, most of our teachers are teachers that are working with those students. So it's nice that they have not only the personal connection with the child, but then the academic and curriculum they can bring up throughout the year. They have them in their own classes. They're talking with colleagues. Like we did this during summer school. We could add on to this. Just this week, they were doing Egypt in the third grade, and they came down to me, and remember we did this at summer school? Do you still have those things? So I was pulling out things and handing it to them that we had taught. Having that connection of teaching it helps, but her colleague that was teaching with her, was able to pull that information in too. So yes, I think there is a good connection. Could there be more? Yes.
I think we also set up some templates of how to design the theme-based lessons last summer, and you could take those same tools and apply it to a school year lesson. And right now, Natalia and Rhonda and Sarah Louise and I are working, and actually a larger group was brainstorming last night about some professional development that we'll offer in early May on how to embed more of the language targets right into their lesson design, so that the lessons are all ready to serve multilingual learners. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And that they would transfer into their school year lesson design as well.
Right, so when we talk about providing services and language supports to students, that's something that everybody can do, right? Not only multilingual student teachers. And so when I've worked with and collaborated with other teachers in the summer and we've worked with them, I know they've taken some of our vocabulary support and just other language supports that we applied to their teaching throughout the year.
And might I add that it's not just our bilingual learners that benefit from this type of instruction. A lot of students, particularly our low-income students, also benefit from this type of instruction.
And then finally, Natalia, I was curious, I appreciate you identifying content comprehension, because that is hugely important. Don't need to tell you that, but can you just touch briefly or offer an example of what that might look like, or how that has empowered those student learners or EL students to become more successful just by comprehending the subject matter?
Right. So a lot of times the vocabulary or the language we use can be a barrier to understanding the content. And so figuring out ways to make the topics comprehensible so that everybody can understand it. So it can be simple things like adding visuals. Vocabulary instruction is a big one, just being able to teach students the target vocabulary that is going to be used so that when it's being used within the classroom is easily accessible for them. And another big one that's part of the site of strategies is just building that background knowledge. A lot of times we assume everybody knows a certain topic or is based on, X, Y, and Z, but when you have different lived experiences, then that background knowledge might be different. And so being able that's made explicit throughout the lessons so that it's not a missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding what science, math, language arts, any of those topics.
Thank you.
I have one
Oh,
question, I'm
one more
sorry.
question. Yep.
So, Amy, you were talking about, we don't know that we would have enough staff, I guess, if we wanted to just open it up to everyone. Do you have an idea of how many students would participate without the invitation?
Not yet.
How many are doing it currently? Or how many, I suppose, invitations went out for this?
K-8, probably 1,500. So it's hard to say how wide that would go from our 8,000 to 10,000 students, how many of those would sign in.
Sure. I appreciate the work you're all doing on this. I think it's excellent, and I'm glad that you were able to kind of take some of the information that the staff gave you to keep adding on for the next years.
Well, and both of these ladies are very humble. It wasn't Amy's team. It was we had hundreds of people involved in making this happen last year. And our teacher leaders were critical in taking a concept that the planning team, the original kind of idea team came up with, and then making it real. I just wanted to share very quickly about I've lost my slides, but the Wallace Foundation opportunity that we have is pretty incredible. And I don't think we necessarily knew going into it exactly how useful this would be. But we were invited to join those 44 districts across the country. The Wallace Foundation, using the research that was done by the RAND Corporation on what works in summer learning, thank you, has pulled together best practices and is meeting weekly with these 44 districts to provide professional development in each of the best practice areas. And what was encouraging is to find out that our Summer of Discovery model is nearly exactly aligned with those best practices. So the tweaking that we are doing, the continuous improvement we are doing, also aligns right with those practices. And so I feel like it was a good confirmation that we're on the right track. We know that the federal dollars for COVID are limited in time. We have until September of 2024 to have those dollars available, and these are dollars that were specifically assigned by the federal government to be used in summer and out of school time. So not to be used during the school day, specifically in this. And so we also are building the case as we go forward for what impact we're making with students, both academically, socially, well-being, so that we can tell that story and get perhaps even national funding to be able to extend us beyond when the COVID dollars end. We're also putting aside the funds that we would normally spend on summer through targeted services so that we have those dollars as well. So we're trying to capture this moment in time where we have this dedicated funding to set the chance for future success. So this isn't just a 3-year effort. This is 3 years of innovation to set us up for the future beyond that. So I really want you to know that we're thinking well beyond that. The only commitment that we have to make back to the Wallace Foundation is to complete their roadmap, and I had put that in board docs for you. And it really is a planning document. And again, it's well aligned to what we're already doing, but it does stretch us to go to those next steps and really nail down some of the thoughts that we have. Definitely focus on strategy, strategic approaches, and they're providing us lots of high quality resources, both during the 2 hours every Tuesday afternoon, and we get an hour of coaching every week, and we get a PLC. And so lots of free professional development coming in as we're already trying to work on this. It's just fantastic. And if we can brag a little bit, we were actually asked to present at one of the sessions, so that was kind of fun. So that's what we have for you today. Any other?
Ms. Nathan?
I saw I think it was in one of the attached documents, that one of the things you're doing is looking at the academic growth over the course of the program. Are there any plans to look at these students as a cohort and track their academic progress into the school year?
Ideally, I think Peter's in the back of the room. Is he giving you a thumbs up?
He's giving you a salute.
He's giving us a thumbs up.
Yes, we'll have the capacity to do that. So,
Great, thanks.
you bet.
Ms. McLaughlin?
I have a question for Dr. Pickell and then a comment for the group. You used a word that I didn't write down because I wasn't fast enough about the learning loss. You had a different term?
I like the term unfinished learning.
Unfinished. I knew it was an un, thank you. And then I just want to comment that I remember thinking when you were presenting this last year, and that you were talking about even back then about how you were going to make improvements for the following year. So it's really neat to see that coming through and that so much work has gone in celebrating that. I also really want to celebrate the emphasis on equity. That's really exciting to see and can't wait to see more of that. And I appreciate the fact that you are putting that front and center in your presentation, so thank you.
I just have one follow-up. In terms of the funding, so I just want to be clear, because those COVID dollars would essentially be going away, you're asking the Wallace Foundation to supplement, or where would that money come from?
We could ask Wallace eventually, but I think there will be other sources as well, and they will be a good connection for us to some of those other sources. And Dr. Pickell already has some ideas too on where else we can look. So.
Yes, because I was thinking, obviously, the student data and academic achievement, but I also think that there are a number of economic advantages to this too, you know, for students whose parents work and are not able to take them to Europe or wherever for the summer, to be able to have the students in a place that is safe and they're gaining something would mean that the parents could work without restriction essentially over the summer during those times. I also appreciate the enhancement on equity, and I think it's helpful to have somebody whose third language is English, be able to work with multilingual learners, and somebody who's been doing, you know, summer school for 35 years plus, because I think that just, it helps sort of round out a thing that we as a district and probably other public schools have just been missing in what summer schools should look like. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We will move on to 7.01, School Start Times Evaluation and Planning. Dr. Pickell.
Thank you, Dr. Marvin and directors of the school board. I am giving Ms. Severson a chance to bring up one slide. For those of you who are wondering why we're talking about start times at this point in the year, I think it's incumbent, even though I've done this every time I've brought this up, to remind us why we are where we are. We made a change in start times for the current school year, And then in keeping with the general spirit of what we just heard about summer discovery, we did an evaluation. And we heard that the school board's intent in changing those start times for older students was largely very much achieved, and that our high school students and middle school students were more alert and had other personal well-being benefits. But we also learned, unfortunately, that many of our youngest learners were missing some prime learning time in the mornings. And we heard that from parenting adults and from teachers in particular. And so the board made a decision, thank you, Michelle, that we should take a look at the prospect of moving elementary schools to the beginning of our transportation system. And the board certainly did so knowing that we are also grappling with a structural budget deficit, and so we need to be practical even as we are trying to respond to that feedback that we got from our youngest learners and the people who educate them and from their parents. And so we had a very robust study session last week in which the board outlined quite a number of issues that they wanted to understand. The first of which was cost, because if we can't afford it, to go forward with even considering it would be wasting time and resources. And so with really heroic effort on the part of Scott Sheridan, our Executive Director of Operations, and Jeff Cappers, who's our Transportation Coordinator, and John Gates, who's with our bus contractor, and many others who I don't know, we went through a painstaking process, dramatically accelerated from what we usually would do, to redraw our entire transportation system to accommodate the new boundaries and the opening and closing of schools that is happening next fall. So the whole chessboard had to be recreated. And once that was done, we could ask the question of what would it cost to move start times for elementary kids to the top of the tier. And I have estimates for you now of those costs. And I'm gonna hopefully be able to click them through on the board here. It's just one slide. But the brevity of the slide belies the work that went into it. And before I share that with you, I need to say these are estimates. Transportation costs are entirely elastic with enrollment, and so if we have fewer kids or more kids, they can go up and down. But we have a really skilled staff and a really skilled bus contractor and first student, and so I think these are very meaningful numbers, even though they could change. So, the first issue is what is it going to cost over our current projected transportation costs to implement the new boundary changes and to open the new schools, such as Dakota Middle School. So this is no change in our current start times. So we'd be at 8:20 for secondary, 9:35 a.m. for elementary. It would require 5 new routes to make the new transportation system work. Each route is about $65,000. So we're looking at a cumulative increase of $324,030 to implement our new boundary changes and opening our new schools and closing Friedel. So that is a cost that is essentially sunk because the board has made the decision to move forward with the boundary changes and obviously opening new schools. And so we will be building that amount into the budget proposal that you will receive in June. The second piece involves non-public transportation. By law, public school districts are required to provide transportation to non-public schools, private schools, also charter schools, which are public schools, if they request it, and the district is reimbursed for that transportation, but it's on a 2-year lag. And so you get reimbursed for your actual costs, but you don't get it in the year you provide the service. The school district also does have flexibility to assign the start time for those other schools that they, if they choose to utilize our transportation system. In keeping with past practice and in doing these estimates, we've asked ourselves, if the non-public schools in Rochester choose to use our transportation services next year, what might it cost? Again, it would be an actual cost to the district next year, and then would be reimbursed. So the estimate for that was it would take 4 new morning routes to make the boundary changes, the school routes work, and so that would be an additional $129,612. So our total cost, if those if the private schools choose to bus with us for our new transportation structure, would be an increase in our transportation costs of $453,640. The $324 is built in. The $129 is prudent budgeting. And now comes the question of what if we change the start times? because changing the start times does require additional buses on the street. And this was the critical analysis that most recently our team has been putting together. This would move elementary schools to 8 a.m. and secondary schools to 9:15. It would require another 5 bus routes, by coincidence, the same amount, so another $324,000 increase. And once again, we need to consider if the private schools chose to utilize our routes and if we gave them the same start times as Rochester Public Schools, which we would not be required to do, but that's been past practice, and so that's how we budgeted that. That would be another 5 routes. I'm not quite to the private schools. So there's the 5 routes for the boundary changes. There's 5 additional routes for the earlier start time. And there's the private schools. There's 4 routes for if the private schools chose. So what's the story here? If we moved to the new 8 a.m. start time with elementary schools, we'd have an increase over current transportation costs of $907,000 versus $453,000 if we stayed where we are. In meeting with our chair and vice chair this week for our executive committee meeting, we determined, and I know the chair's been in conversation with you as board members, that this level of cost increase is within scope to go out to our stakeholders and seek their opinion on the merits of moving elementary school start times. My rule of thumb was if it was more than $1 million increase, we shouldn't even investigate it. This is not quite $1 million increase. And so I think given the seriousness of the issues that we heard about earlier this year, it makes sense to consider this further. So 2 things are going to happen. One, the board has requested answers to a series of questions about everything from childcare to extracurricular activities. And we are putting together answers to those questions, and the board will receive that as part of the board preparation packet next Monday in advance of a discussion of this issue on the May 3rd agenda at the board meeting on May 3rd. Tomorrow morning, a survey will go out to all 3 key stakeholder groups, parenting adults, students, and staff, to seek their opinions on the pros and cons of shifting to an 8 a.m. start time. And so that survey will be open from tomorrow, Wednesday the 20th, through a week from Friday. So you'll have a week and a half. And we strongly urge stakeholders to fill that survey out, give us your candid, honest assessment of how it would impact your own learning in life if you're a student, your child's learning life if you're a parenting adult, or of course your work with kids if you're a staff member. So we'll be combining these 2 sources of information, analysis of the questions the board wanted answered, and the input from stakeholders for a presentation to the board on May 3rd, at which time the board will engage in a discussion of the merits of potentially making this shift. The final point I want to make is we are cognizant of the lateness in the year in which this is happening. We know many families, we know many staff are hot in the midst of making plans, not just for summer, which we just heard about, but for next fall. And so we have tried to do this as quickly as we possibly can, understanding that there are a lot of details to get right. It is possible, and this is not a recommendation, though I do anticipate making a recommendation to the board on May 3rd, it is possible not to make these changes for the fall of 2022, but to do so for the fall of 2023. And so our only window to consider these options is not this May. There's the possibility of deferring these. I'm sure that people will have strong feelings about the pros and cons of doing that. But that's where we are with this projection and this analysis. And I'd be glad to take questions, and I'm sure I'd call Scott Sheridan up if you have some more specific questions about the transportation route structure as well.
Samuelson.
So the bottom line dollar amount, it's probably too late for us to make additional cuts to accommodate that. So I'm assuming we would be drawing from the reserve that we were saving for next year to offset next year's budget, and then those cuts would have to happen next year, or have we identified something in the current projected budget that we could supplant?
Director Amundsen, we have not yet, but I would anticipate between now, we just got this, between now and when we bring a budget recommendation to you in June, we'll have a recommendation about how we should cover these costs. Fund balance is one option, additional reductions are another option. And so we'll be building this into the final budget proposal that you receive in June.
Ms. Nathan?
So you mentioned that we do have the capacity to set the start times for the private schools. Were we to set it at a time different than the 8 o'clock elementary, 9:15, is transportation telling us that that $259,000 would be significantly less, or?
Depending on the choices they make, it could be zero. I'll just say, many of you know I worked for quite a while in St. Paul Public Schools, and when we were facing significant budget cuts, we had to tell our private and charter school friends that they would have the last tier in our route structure because we had to serve our own families first, and they understandably chose not to use our busing services because they would have gotten the last tier. We didn't do that lightly. We used to give them the tiers exactly aligned with our schools, but when the budgets got tight, we chose to prioritize St. Paul kids and families at that time. So that could be an option. I also will say we are really excited about helping all learners in Rochester succeed, and so that's why we budgeted it this way, that should they choose to take advantage of our start times, that's what the cost is. But it's we've had conversations with folks in our private school community about what they think they might do, but we don't know until we actually have our decision made, and I think they would quite quickly let us know, like probably 5 minutes later, what they're choosing to do.
Ms. McLaughlin?
Can you speak to the idea, because I know that this has been a complicated issue and lots of discussion, that the alternative for next year, you have specific times there. Are those flexible, or is that, if we're going to make a change next year, that's it? Can you explain why you picked those times?
Thank you, Director McLaughlin. When we received the evaluation results back in January that, as you know, had the major finding about elementary school, we knew it was already very late in the year, and so we knew that to try and engage in a process of ideating lots of options would have made it impossible for us to complete the analysis that we've just finished. And so the one option that our transportation staff felt ready to recommend as a viable alternative was one that the board considered previously. It was famously option C in your deliberations before I got here, because we knew from the analysis that we did at that time that we could make it work. And so the only option that we have looked at this year was the 8 a.m. elementary start, because it would have been just way beyond scope for us to have gotten the other analysis done this spring. Could we look at other times with more lead time? Yes, we absolutely could. But I know, as the board knows, we have had staff who have been stretched very thin in the midst of staff shortages in the pandemic. In fact, Scott Sheridan, who has led this work, was late for a cabinet meeting this morning because he was out riding a bus. And so it has been continually trying to pull on those issues. Going forward, yes, we could do analysis of other options, but we would need to have a more deliberate amount of time to make that work.
Ms. Nathan?
And under our current tiered system, no matter what the options were that we looked at, we would still have to have that hour and 15-minute spacing between the elementary and the secondary time. So you almost could do your own math. If you move elementary any earlier or later, add an hour and 15 minutes, and you'll get what the relevant high school time would be.
Unless we significantly change our either boundaries or structures of schools that have citywide transportation, then lots of other things are possible.
Thank you, Dr. Pickell.
Thank you.
7.02, discipline data update. Again, Dr. Pickell.
Chair Marvin, directors of the board, I'm glad to ask Dr. Peter Ruck, who's our Director of Research, Assessment and Evaluation, and Chris Lingen, who's our Director of Secondary Education, to come up. The relatively brief presentation that we're going to give the board at this time and the community is a down payment on a much longer and more detailed presentation that we will give in the summer. And it is where we are year to date in our discipline data. We know that school discipline has been much on the minds of many educators, parents, students, not just in Rochester, but around the country. And in past years, we've usually done one presentation on this data, And as I talked with the chair and vice chair, we thought that because this is a subject of interest, we would do a preliminary presentation that shows where we are year to date. These data will be aggregate, which is to say we're going to look at actual data for Rochester Public Schools, but we're not looking at individual schools at this presentation. This is kind of like a pulse check. We will be looking at individual schools in the summer. And most importantly, we will be turning the discussion to ways we address these data, including the disparities between the disciplinary infractions that are found among student groups. So I want to turn over to Peter, who's taken the lead in pulling together this initial analysis. It's great to have him on board, and I'll just say this is one of several projects where Peter and a veteran practitioner like Chris have been really rolling up our sleeves to bring clarity to how we code our data, because there are many, many state and federally mandated ways to code discipline data, and when those change or when those contradict, it gets very hard for us to accurately track where we are over time. So while the presentation that they're going to give now may look familiar to people who've been looking at discipline data for a long time, I'm enthused because I think we are getting increasingly clear and tight about the categories that define disciplinary incidents, which of course is going to help inform our strategies to address them. So, Peter.
All right, good evening. Good to be with you again. And as Dr. Pakel mentioned, a brief discipline data overview this evening, a teaser for our more detailed dive come summertime. Overview. Overall, our recorded office referrals are down over the last several years. Out-of-school suspensions are also down slightly, although there's some caveats to that bullet point that I'll get into in the next couple of slides. The 2020 and 21 rates were very low due to the use of virtual learning during the pandemic, so they throw off some of our trend data a bit. I'll cover that as well. And we do have some disproportionate impact affecting some of our subgroups of students. When I say disproportionate impact, the easiest way to understand it is by way of example. So if there's no disproportionate impact at all, the racial and ethnic breakdown, just as an example to use race and ethnicity, of your students will match the breakdown of students who are disciplined, right? So if we have 60% white students, we would expect 60% of disciplinary actions to be white students. When we don't see those match up, and when those gaps get sort of large, that's when we see disproportionate impact. It's just a fancy way of saying a group of students is overrepresented in the data compared to what we think they should be. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So our first slide here shows you since the 17-18 academic year through April 1st of each year, so we're comparing apples to apples, the total recorded office referrals. If you were to go back in time even further, you would see an even more pronounced decrease over time. But as you can see, we're trending slightly downwards a little bit over 5 years. Right now, our total office referrals through April 1st are right around 3,000 referrals, with a little bit less this year. This slide shows you the distribution of what discipline actions are actually taken. So what we're saying is, for example, in 2017, 2018, 2% of discipline actions were administrative removals, 20% were out-of-school suspensions, 37% were other actions. As you can see over time, our use of various strategies has changed, and the proportion of discipline actions that we're taking, specifically out-of-school suspensions that we've been watching more closely, has increased over time, from 20% of actions in 2017-18 to 30% this year. However, because our total number of incidents has continued to decrease, that doesn't mean that we necessarily have more suspensions this year than in prior years. As you can see here, suspensions continued upwards for a few years before peaking and then stabilizing. So that first bullet point on the first slide that I showed you about out-of-school suspensions starting to trend downwards, they are. And if we had data from last year, it's likely that we would see sort of a plateau and a slight decrease. Of course, it'll be interesting to see where we get towards the end of the year once we have our final data. We don't know where that'll end up because they're all pretty close. What you're seeing now is the actual counts of discipline actions taken broken down by student race and ethnicity for this academic year. As you can see in this slide, our Black students and our Latino students are experiencing disproportionate impact in that they're much more likely to be disciplined than the other racial and ethnic groups presented. You also will see the breakdown of all of the different disciplinary actions and the counts taken so far this year. And it looks like on this version, our text box is overlapping a little bit on the totals, so I apologize, those are misaligned. But that last line is the total count for each column. Besides race and ethnicity, there are a number of other student characteristics that we analyze when looking at our discipline data. One of them is whether or not a student is receiving special education services. So among office referrals for this academic year, 38% of students who were referred received special education students versus 62% who did not. That's compared to about 16% of our students who receive special ed services currently. So again, you're seeing disproportionate impact in this case by having them overrepresented. The last group that I'll speak about briefly is student gender identification. Now, in keeping with every national data set you can think of, all the research that's out there, male students are about 2.7 times more likely to be disciplined overall in our data. However, when they're disciplined, female students are about 50% more likely to be suspended than male students. So while they're less likely to be to have a disciplinary action taken overall, female students are more likely to be suspended when they are. So you actually have two different types of disproportionate impact at play here. Male students are disproportionately impacted for discipline overall. They're overrepresented in our discipline data. But female students are overrepresented in our suspensions. Does that make sense how both can take place at the same time? So those are the overall demographic trends affecting our discipline data so far. And I will turn it over to my veteran colleague, Chris, since he smirked earlier at that comment.
He's younger than I am, so.
Call me old or?
Chris, I think that's what he was doing, was calling you old, yeah.
I was gonna make a comment earlier about Benjamin Franklin with you.
No, he and I did not graduate the same class. I was a year ahead of him, so.
Good. Some ongoing efforts that we're using to address some of these disciplinary actions is developing and implementing our school-wide strategies, continue to do that. Conducting the Perspective Project, which I've gotten a little bit of information on that from some of our staff, and it's been unbelievable the amount of information that they've been able to collect and to talk through with us and learn about. Adding targeted positions of support such as our equity specialists, affirming our disciplinary policies and procedures, reassigning schools for a small number of students, enhanced case planning for students receiving special educational services, our restorative practices working group, and their partnership with CERT that's starting with Willow Creek and Mayo.
And that concludes our brief dive into discipline data.
Ms. Nathan.
Well, thank you for this, and thank you for the colorful graphs. That does make it easier to understand. And this might not be a question that you can answer tonight. Maybe it's something I think forward to in June, but I know we have members of our community who have been tracking our discipline data over time. And I'm wondering, as you're honing in on the categories and tracking the data more, I guess, better, if someone were to look at the office referral data in a presentation we had given in a previous year and looked at that number and saw the number in your data, would they be the same? Or because you're categorizing them better, finding data, will we see a difference in that comparison data historically?
So the 6 categories that you saw in these slides, with the exception of like out-of-school suspension, which is just one thing, are categories that we created to collapse a long list of codes into 6 simple categories. So the short answer is yes, the overall numbers should match, but how they're broken down might be different to someone else in the community just because of the decisions that we made on the analysis side to get them into 6 categories.
But you're providing us with the historical data, so this is probably the best source of historical data is to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges within your categorization.
Yep.
Okay.
It's going to be the same numbers. It looks better and analyzed better from the time when I've done it to the time when Carl done it. I don't mean to make Carl sound, but he probably knew more than I did with it. But it's analyzed better than what it was. That's not what my degree is in at all. And we've learned a lot. It's a whole area of my brain that I don't have to use anymore now, I think, within this part. But it's helped us to see things that, example, with the piece with the female students, we would have that data, but just to be able to pull that out and analyze that, it's different having Peter be able to do that now.
Ms. McLaughlin.
And that actually, I have a follow-up to Director Nathan's question, and I don't know which of you this will be best for, so you choose. These different 6 categories, can you help us better define those for people who may have not seen these categories before? You know, what's the difference between an admin removal and an out-of-school suspension? And then, second question, because I can't wait to ask, the other action seems like a pretty big number. If you could tell us a little bit more about that category.
So admin removal is removing of a student less than a school day and non-special ed. So example, if something happens second hour or third hour and they're just going to send them out for the day, that's administrative removal instead of suspension.
But removal means out of school?
Yep. So they're similar within that piece of it.
And you said non-special ed?
Non-special ed.
Okay.
OSS is out for the day or multiple days. You could not do, if Peter and I had an issue.
And we do frequently.
Yep, and we were going to be out of school tomorrow, we wouldn't be in administrative removal.
And how about the consultation?
Consultations would be conferences with parent, conference with student, conference with counselor, conference, there's a whole list of things that DERS gives us that we can put into Skyward, and those are all consultations. Give me a second, and I'll get to that right piece here. I can give you them all. There's, conference with admin, conference with counselor, conference with parent, conference with student, and all that is what it comes down to. When I was principal at Jefferson, a lot of times it may have been a conference with a student, but I met with the parent also, and I just happened to click the student button. You know what I mean? And so just because it says conference with student doesn't mean that they're going to call the parent at the same time.
And how about other action?
Other actions could be behavior contract, detention, individualized instruction, letter of apology, loss of privileges, restitution, restorative, hit them all. Class removal, which we don't use very often. Yeah, but those are the ones within that part of it. Conflict mediation, if I said that.
And if I can just follow up on that, one of my concerns in, tracking this and following this for some time now is I'm concerned about the disparities in both the consultation and the other. The question whether there's disparate impact on those 2 categories, thinking that an administrator, has a white kid in the conference and does this, a person of color and does something different. Is that something we can track more deeply, dig more deeply into that? I'm particularly concerned because those categories are quite large, and that could be representing some of that disparity if different decisions are being made based on their demographics.
So the short answer is yes, especially within a single academic year, because the codes tend to be consistent within a single year. Across years, it gets a lot more difficult because the codes that are in use in any given year have changed over time. So looking at longitudinal data gets way more complicated. I did do an analysis of all of I think there were 44 different codes this year that we had in the data set. And you could break it down that way. The problem is, in some of those areas, you start getting into really small numbers. And so there may be, it may very well be that there's disproportionate impact in, say, letters of apology, but there might only be 20 letters of apology, and it starts getting of questionable utility to break it down that far. That being said, I agree with you completely that other action is the catch-all and is a big block of it. And we could absolutely break that down further into other items of interest when we come back to you. If
Remember, those are just level 2s, what those would be. Those would be level 2s that don't have a suspension, that we aren't doing an action where we are taking a kid out of school. When we did OCR, those are the things that we looked at. We looked at level 2s. And I think we started to focus a little bit more on the out-of-school behaviors, or the things that students being for out of school or administrative removal because that's loss of class time. Remember, level 2s, it's a lot of reteaching within that piece of it.
And then I just had one final follow-up that, I lost my thought. It was something that you said, Peter, that.
Melissa, do you want to ask your question?
Yes,
and
go
then
ahead.
come
Yeah,
back
yep,
to
yep,
you,
come back.
Karen?
So I'm back on slide 3, which just talks about office referrals, and I'm looking at that trend, which appears to be downward. When anecdotally, what we're hearing is post-pandemic increased behavior concerns. Can you explain that for me, or speculate?
Yes. Good. Yes, it feels like there's more because I think when I was here last time or the time before, we talked about more physical aggression things. I think that's where we're feeling more of that increase within, there's more physical aggressive things that are happening.
But yet the number, unless I'm reading the chart wrong, the numbers are
The
down.
numbers are down, but we can have, but you're still having that feeling of, okay, there's more physical aggression pieces that have been happening, more larger things that happen, so it feels like there's more things. We were
So-
surprised the data was going down too.
Are you
When Peter
saying
went through that.
fewer incidents but more serious incidents, or more concerning incidents, or a
think-
change
I
in
wouldn't
the
want to put
flavor,
serious more
or-
into that.
Okay.
I think
amount, but-
visibility might be a better word.
More
to use,
visible.
Right?
Yeah, that's a
There
good word.
aren't more incidents, it's just that the incidents that are occurring may be more visible. In addition, it is site-specific, right? Part of what we will come back with in June is that we do see some differences depending on which school sites you're at, which can also, right, lead to a sense of the increased visibility of incidents if you're at a school that may be struggling a little more than some of the others with these issues.
Okay, thank you.
I remembered my question. Can we ask before I forget, because I'm old? And Peter, what triggered it for me is you talked about the different codes over the period of time.
Yep.
Can you help us lock down the codes now so that we can project in the future?
That's
and
part of what
use
we're
the-
doing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
But part
Yes.
of with the codes too, we have to worry about what DERS does.
Yep.
What is DERS, remind me?
I can't, it's a state thing, what is it?
Well,
Disciplinary,
it's
It's the state's codes.
yeah. I can't think of all the codes. that go through,
Discipline
but-
something system.
Yeah, and they changed the codes this year in October, and we didn't change our information, we're gonna do that now this summer to kind of change it to match it again here.
But Chris hits on an important point, which is, if the state determines that something is a priority, they'll create a code for us to track it. And doesn't mean it wasn't happening before, it's just that it was coded differently.
And I think that's helpful for people listening to know
Sure.
that it's not us, it's, a combination of things, so that's helpful. Thank you.
Dr. Garcia.
Incident reporting system.
Nice.
DERS.
I had
DERS.
yes, I had a couple of questions as well. So the data analysis, thank you for that. How will it lead to specific recommendations, and who is going to give those to us or the schools?
Well, I think the next step on our side here is bringing more data, more in-depth analysis to you in June. As for the next steps with school leadership, I'd have to turn that over to maybe Dr. Pical, since he's raising his finger.
Yeah, I think Dr. Garcia, bringing recommendations to the board is very important, and it's something that I think we will be thinking about for June at the policy level. In the meantime, Chris and his counterpart, Nicole Mueller from our special education department, are meeting with every school leadership team on their data 3 times this spring. And we will be convening all of our secondary schools for a 2-day summit in June to retrospectively look back on the last year and, most importantly, plan for the next year going forward. So we'll be bringing recommendations and reports to you in June, but we're not waiting for that. That's happening right now. And it's quite structured in terms of helping our building leaders see the data, what's happening, begin to form their own hypotheses to the question, for instance, that Dr. Amundsen was just asking, well, I thought things feel worse, and then turning toward solutions. And so that's a structured process that we have going. We'll be bringing everyone together in June, and we'll be eager to share that with you when we come together at the board meeting in June as well.
Okay. I have a couple others, just two others, but they're sort of like intertwined with one another. So, when could an other action item meet the threshold of being its own category? What would you be looking for?
It's a good question. Honestly, it was a judgment call. I just looked at, I knew that certain particular items were a particular interest, right? Out of school suspension is obviously one we've been tracking for some time. But other than that, it was items that were similar together and items that had low counts.
Okay.
And I just sort of had to make a cutoff at some point.
Because it sort of goes, I think, with Director McLaughlin and I were sort of on the same brainwave there, where I appreciate the data and the recognition of disparity for each category, but I'm wondering, like, within that particular category, I think would be helpful. So I guess what I'm imagining is how would we preserve the continuity of a particular variable? So like if we took out, let's see, for example, like a letter of apology from other action, because that one, for whatever reason, we had like 100 something in 1 year.
Sure.
And then it goes into its own category. Excellent, I suppose. When would that happen? And how would we account for something like that, like, or other confounding variables and within like a particular thing? So if we, like, I don't need to know if we have an N of one category, which is like 2, so we would obviously know which students they are. Like, we as the board don't necessarily need to know that. But how would you, or how would any of us, I guess, support people within that particular school in addressing that particular issue? Because it sounds like this, maybe the number of incidents isn't increasing, but the severity or the acuity of the incident is increasing. So I want people who need to know that data to respond with effective recommendations. And I would also like to know that information, but I'm okay with it being somewhat categorical so that we're not outing students or certain educators, but I want the assurance that someone is going to deal with the thing that needs to be dealt with, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Mr. Barlow.
Yes, and it makes sense, and I think Dr. Piquet mentioned that they'll be doing that debriefing later. 2 quick questions. Is it your intent, it certainly is my desire to know what the impact upon school climate and or student learning may be as a result of these disciplinary actions as they occur? Are you able, or is this inquiry outside the scope of not tonight's presentation, but outside the scope of the reason for presenting discipline data? I would hope personally that it's more than just reporting out A, B, C, D, but we can also maybe track and understand the impact, again, school climate. Many of our board members have received copious amounts of emails regarding that, but also student learning. And then secondly, can we hope for and potentially see a consistency of reporting both to the board and to the community moving forward? As has been suggested over the years, different, of no fault of the district, the state may change codes, and so it's not uncommon for us to see different metrics presented before us. Can we hope to have a consistent pattern of information presented to the board, as well as released to the public, to where when we're talking apples, and everyone can see the changes and see how the strategies we're using to address behaviors and improve outcomes.
Ms. Workman. Oh,
Well, all I was going to say, although the back and forth now made me lose my train of thought. No, I hear what you're saying, and it's certainly point well taken. I think the only real challenge is that longitudinal piece when you're looking at codes changing over time. A fair number of the codes that that have either dropped out of use or started use are part of what are in that other category as well, which is where you get some of those really low counts between years and so forth. But yes, that is the plan.
You know what codes don't change? Out-of-school suspension.
That's exactly right. That one never
Those
changes.
things don't change, and so that's part of that piece, I think, to look at. Answering your first question, yes. That's part of what Nicole and I are doing, and it's not intentional, it just happened to come up, some of that school culture piece. And today at John Marshall, that was our meeting too, and we didn't look at any of the data because they had already had the data. It was more about that school culture and that student learning piece, that they're learning the students not in class and those type of things and why. Instead of our data of these 6 kids have been suspended, that wasn't the conversation today. It was into that part of it.
Thank you.
I would just briefly add, if you approve the strategic plan that's making its way to you in June, there's major emphasis on both school culture and belonging. And we will have a dashboard to measure everything in the strategic plan. And so we will need to find valid and reliable measures of school culture and belonging. And I think, to your point, Director Barlow, it would be very important and interesting to look at the intersection between discipline rates and school culture and belonging once we have a good measure of those two things. And we'll be turning to the measurement work as soon as we have a final version of the plan, because we'll need ways to measure everything in the plan.
I think that perspectives project, I can't say it that fast, is going to be another key within that culture piece. That's what we talked about a lot, Jam, today, and that's a piece I think within the culture is going to be helpful for us for our future with it.
Thank you. Ms. Workman.
Yes, the discipline actions taken by student gender ID, that's a new category that we haven't seen before. So I have a question. If you have 10 male students with, say, the same infraction and 10 female students with the same infraction, does this mean that the male students are going to be 2.7 times more likely to be disciplined? So
No.
are we comparing the number and quality of infractions being the same in both groups?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, no. Although in general, because that would get very busy in the slides, so to speak. This doesn't take into account anything about what the infraction was. This slide is simply the discipline action taken.
I guess I'm supposed to respond.
You look confused.
Yeah, you can't even see my face on, I look confused. I guess what I'm saying is, if the males are actually making or having 2.7 times more infractions than the females, then what's the goal? To get those infractions to match?
Our goal isn't to spend
Well,
girl.
Is it-
I mean,
Well,
Are they 2.7 times more likely to be hit with a disciplinary infraction if you're a boy, or is it 2.7 times the numeric difference? My sense, if I remember the slide, is it's the former.
Correct.
So if 10% of girls are getting a disciplinary infraction, then 30% of boys are getting a disciplinary infraction, and they're leading to the X percent more likely to get a disciplinary infraction.
Okay,
Was
so
that
that's-
what that
so that's-
stat
Okay, so
was?
that's what you're looking for.
Correct.
That's what
Because I
that
know,
stat-
I know the issue that's going to be raised would be something like, if boys are actually misbehaving more than girls, then of course you would expect the disciplinary actions taken to be more for them than for girls. So that's kind of what I'm trying to wrap my head around.
So they're more likely to be disciplined, period. For the girls, when they are disciplined, so that group of girls that are
Okay.
disciplined, the suspension happens at a 50%.
Right, I
rate,
got
essentially.
that.
Correct. Yep.
Melissa?
So I realize that we are required to report our discipline data using categories that are given to us, the racial and the gender and the special ed status and those types of things. Are we able to find other categories that might help us tell the story a little bit better by a creative examination of our demographic data that we do have? Or just, be able to dive down a little farther into what might get us closer to individual students rather than grouping students who might be very different from each other into one category.
Part of what we have to do is Skyward. We have a poll that goes to DERS.
Uh-huh.
So at the end of the year, our data for secondary, Skyward just, DERS, excuse me, pulls that out of Skyward, or Skyward dumps it, however it works. It goes from here to here. And so that piece, we have to have those codes
Right.
that match with DERS.
Right.
And then the other part, second part of your question.
Is there
I
a way
haven't
for
answered.
us to come up with our own categories that will more accurately tell the story of the students in our
Well, that's
district?
part of what those discipline meetings are that we've talked about with Nicole and I, is we dive deep into that piece of these 6 students or these 12 students, and we go right into that piece, what's going on with these students, or they haven't had something since October, why? Or,
Yes.
you know, things that they've set up. An example, Century High School has had some things that, with some students that they've had issues with, but they haven't had anything since December. And they didn't realize, oh my gosh, we set up this, this, and this. Next year, we're going to set up these things immediately in September, then waiting till November.
Yeah,
for
but,
some of the
but
species.
what I'm saying, can you then take what you're doing in those meetings where you're really looking at the individual student and find other patterns that might help us to identify interventions? And I'll just give you a couple of examples off the top of my head. Racial groups is, based on physical characteristics or self-identifying versus similar cultural backgrounds, similar family backgrounds, similar experiences, like they moved several times between districts. I mean, there's an almost infinite number of possibilities, but you are the ones who know the individual students, and maybe if you say, what is it that this group has in common, that they've experienced housing insecurity this year, or something that will help us to do something more than just grouping
Yep.
not very similar students into categories.
That would have to be done by the building, because they would know their students. I don't know, I know who some of the students are, but I don't know them. So that'd be the bit on the buildings to go through, okay, these 14 kids have been with us just this year, or these 12 kids have experienced this happening. No, that would have to go through the building. I wouldn't have that information because it's not.
Right.
I would just say, though, to support the buildings, we are on the verge, and we're looking at 2 demos this week of buying a system that will allow us to take different data sets and essentially crunch the numbers together. And so that you could look at kids who are having disciplinary infractions, and then what do those kids report about sense of belonging on a survey that we give? Or what are the attendance patterns of those kids? Or what are the credit losses of those kids? And we need a data system because, as Chris says, you have to be able to do this at the building level, but buildings actually have to educate kids, so they don't have time to build data systems. And so we need a system that automates for them that level of drill down, so we don't just have to look at who was suspended. We can get underneath the hood and say, what else do we know about who was suspended?
And are we able to create our own categories within that record-keeping system?
We need the data elements, but yes, we could combine the different data sets. So we would need a way we'd need test score data, survey data, attendance data, grade data, and once we have that,
And that
we
new
can.
system will do that?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, it
Exciting.
is.
Ms. Nathan and then Dr. Garcia.
So we always talk a lot about the students who are disciplined and the various categories of action. And I know that we have a lot of parents who have expressed to us, what happens with the students who are affected by the negative behavior? So the student who might have been harmed or somehow involved, but isn't being disciplined, but is feeling the effects of it. I don't want to use the word victim, but another student that is effective. Do we do any, and I know that some of these actions, like you said, a letter or a fix-it plan or some restorative justice, is there any way to give us some information as to how we're addressing those students' needs? If there's behavior and there's a discipline, who else is affected, and how are we meeting those students' needs as well?
That's part of the school culture piece that we've talked about, and that needs to be happening, it needs to be going on. We aren't going to be able to give data on that school culture piece. That's within the building. So that's pieces that they have to work on, that we are digging into and finding that, wait a second, what about this piece too? So that's more the school culture within that. Not really our data can show that.
Dr. Garcia?
Yeah, one more. So the other piece is, our staff puts a lot of work in. We put a lot of communication into the student handbook where we lay out the expectations and what a violation looks like and what the response to the violation is. And I'm wondering if we can, maybe in June, have that information that's in the student handbook almost cross-referenced to these categories. So when I read a student handbook and I look at leaving class without permission, and I look at these consequences, how does that information we're giving to our students and families ultimately connect with the categories that are in this data? And, because this is the information we're putting out to the public of what the expectations are and what happens if you don't meet those expectations. And then we're looking at this data that's a little less explanatory. So I don't know if there's a crosswalk or a cross-reference that might help as part of the presentation just for our reference.
Jess?
Yeah, I kind of want to, I guess, pull two things together. So to sort of speak to Director Amundsen's comments, is the thing that you're asking for are, or at least the examples that you gave, are like vulnerabilities or risk factors for a particular set of students potentially to have X outcome or engage in X behavior. And so I think it would be important, not necessarily that needs to be represented in this data, but that might we as a district gather some of those, gather some of that additional data to identify, like, before the problem happens, like these students may be at risk for X outcome, and then provide the support up front. But then also that leads me to like, and then what are the outcomes? So if we have a student who recidivates often or re-engages in this problematic behavior, which results in whatever outcome, one student who consistently has to be administratively removed from the school, how are we collecting the outcome for what we're doing? Like, is it extinguishing the behavior? Because my assumption is that it's not. So if we're looking at a group of several hundred students that are consistently represented in the data, how are we helping them not show up back in the data for the next school year?
And I think what we're talking here about is the quantitative data that you've been providing, and then the qualitative data, the type we'll get from the Perspectives Project, and that absolutely needs to happen at the schools, because the staff there, typically, they know who the kids are, they know where they're from, they know who the students who continue to show the same behaviors, they get their story. And it's critically important that they have that information, but it's tough to show in a chart.
And if I could just follow up on both of your points, I wasn't expressing the need to see the data so much as to encourage all of us not to think only in that small box of what we're required to look at by law and required to report by law, which I know everybody's doing all the time. And so I don't necessarily want the only reports that we see be the required reports. And so that it was my poor way of expressing that I would also like to hear after that work is done if we've learned anything about it. Not that I want to monitor it along the way.
Ms. Nathan.
Dr. Garcia brought a question to mind. When I look at the count of the discipline actions, in previous presentations, we've always had a slide that says, of this amount, 95% or the unduplicated count, right? So is these numbers on the count of discipline actions, does one student represent more than one number? Is this an unduplicated? Is this
if it's the count, it's duplicated.
Okay.
So it's each action that's taken. The one thing that I will say, and actually Dr. Garcia's comment also made me think of this, is I did look at students who show up more than once and how frequently, and it's actually a surprisingly small number. So you get a whole long list of students that are in there once, maybe twice. And then you're looking at maybe 24 that are in there 3 or more. I mean, you're not talking about a systematically large group of students when you're thinking along those lines, but I totally get what you're getting at. It makes good sense.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Peter, it kind of along the same line of what Director Nathan was asking about. I was sort of surprised to see, first of all, I have one very minor thing. Slide 6, can we fix those column totals in board docs so that if people are looking at this later, it makes sense?
Yep, we can. It's even fine in Google Docs. It's just not on the presentation.
I would expect
Yep.
this is probably a slide that people may want to look at, and I want to make sure that it's correct.
Yep.
I was surprised to see, though, that this is the count and not the distribution like slide 9. Is there a way to do the data?
Your distribution is on slide 4.
Slide 4?
Or over years. You're thinking about that specifically.
Distribution by demographic, the race, ethnicity?
Yeah, I could get that for you, certainly.
Okay, I think that would be helpful, because I'm sort of comparing it, that it would be like, I'd like to see the slide 9, not based, it's helpful to have by gender, but based on race and ethnicity as well.
We actually prepared that slide thinking that it might be useful, so
Okay.
I can certainly get that to you if you'd like.
And it would be helpful, and I think also just doing one little note on the side of the distribution of the race, ethnicity within the district, so that we can see where that overrepresentation
Absolutely,
is.
yeah.
That'd be
Yeah.
awesome, thank you.
Yep.
I know go ahead, Chris.
Dr. Marvin said something I've said probably in every time I've been in this piece, and it might help with one thing that came up. Every one of these tells a story. Every discipline event has a story to it. And when you talk to administrators about it, they go through and say, this event happened because X, Y, and Z happened, or these 4 events happened because these things happened. And so part of that, what you asked for was that there's a story within it, and our administrators know those stories and want to share those stories. So when we go through the data, that happens a lot. It's a story time, a little bit of, here's all that's happened with the student, and this is what we're doing to try and fix it.
I know we're going to have you back often, and we're going to continue this discussion, so we thank you for this presentation and look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then we'll move on to 7.03, Fund Balance Policy Review. Dr. Piquel.
Dr. Marvin and directors of the board, it's my pleasure to call up John Carlson, our Executive Director of Finance and Technology, to give you an overview of a recommendation we are suggesting should be submitted to the policy committee for some work.
Thank you, Dr. Piquel and school board members. We are here to do a fund balance policy review. I know we've talked around this subject a few different times in the past, and so I am glad that Director Nathan put this on the calendar so we could finally have a open discussion about this. So first off, fund balance means assets minus liabilities in accounting terms. So it basically means what you have minus what you owe equals what you have left over. So fund balance is what you have left over. In our balance sheets, we have 5 different kinds of fund balances, and I wrote those descriptions there. First off is non-spendable. This is usually expenses we've paid for in the year ahead of when the service is going to be provided to us. So we usually can't get a refund on that money, so the money becomes non-spendable. Restricted means that state law or some other funding source has said you can't use these funds for any other reason but this. So if there's funds left over at the end of the year, then they're set aside in a restricted fund balance. Committed means the school board has taken a vote and has set the funds aside for a particular reason. Assigned means the administration has set something aside for a particular project or a need. And then unassigned means there's no restriction on those funds. Policy 704 has a lot of words. This is the most important paragraph, I think, out of that policy. It basically says, it is the policy of the school district to maintain an unassigned general fund balance of no less than 6% of budgeted general fund expenditures. So why do you need a fund balance anyway? Well, there's 3 big reasons that drive why we want to have a fund balance. First is cash flow. But most people probably don't realize it, but federal funding that we get is on a reimbursement basis, meaning we have to spend our own cash first. We have to take money from our checking account or our savings account. We have to pay for whatever it is, and then we wait for the money to come back to us from the federal government. There's usually a lag there of 1 to 3 months, depending on how often we draw. So just want to point out to anybody who might misunderstand, we are not sitting with $38 million of COVID funding in the bank. We have to spend our own money, meaning fund balance or cash that we have, and then we request reimbursement later. State funding also only pays us 90% of what we're supposed to get paid in the current year, and then the other 10% arrives in the next year. Property tax funding also comes generally 2 times a year. There's a bigger payment in May, a little bit more in June, and then a cleanup payment in July, and then the same happens October, November, December. So you're getting large buckets of money, but you're only getting them twice, and then you're holding on to them as you spend them down. Fund balance also provides us a little bit of cushion. So in a year where you're projecting that maybe your costs are going up faster than your projected revenues, it gives you a little bit of time to kind of spend down the fund balance and then get your expenditures eventually matching more towards your revenues. And then my colleague Jody from Ellers is going to be here tonight to talk about our bond sales that we had this morning, but it's very important to have fund balance when you're having a credit rating call. It's not just for the call, but it's what they're assessing the district's credit worthiness or the ability to basically stay in business without having a financial crisis. Based on having some level of reserve in case something happens unexpectedly. So similar to a credit score of an individual, the higher your credit rating, you usually have lower interest costs. Here's a chart of the last 15 years of actual unassigned fund balance in our general fund, just measured as a percentage of the final expenditures that year. And so you can see historically we were maintaining about a 2-month reserve, or about 16.7% or more. And then we started intentionally spending down the fund balance. There were about 5 years there of basically deficit spending. We were spending more than we were bringing in, and we were pulling down fund balance. All along, we've stayed above the current board policy of 6%, so we've never violated that school board policy. We were coming close to it in FY17, so we needed to watch our budget very carefully. But then we've intentionally been making sure that we budget as tight as we can be, and we've actually been adding some surplus back to the unassigned fund balance 4 years in a row. The green line in the middle there just kind of represents what does a 1-month reserve look like. So if you're measuring that as a percentage. So just put the red and the green to kind of drive conversation around. Most of the time we're in between those two. So it would seem reasonable to say that having a 1 to 2 month reserve is probably somewhere where we could take and not be decimating basically our budget. I did some peer benchmarking. I have access to a lot of data, and so we pulled out our peer group. This is school districts that are 10 to 25,000 students enrolled, public schools in Minnesota. So there were 12 of those, and I just looked at what was the percentage at year end for the 10-year period. Rochester, if you average ours, was actually ranked pretty near the top. We were 4th out of 12, meaning that we consistently have a higher fund balance than most of our peers as a percentage of our expenditures. Of the 120 different data points, just for reference, 25 were below 6%. We were never in that category, of course, and 95 were above. And then if you look at kind of the 1-month marker, or 8.3%, 45 of those data points were below that, and then 75 were above. So it kind of seems like that range that's kind of normal is right about 1 month or so. The average there being 10.3. As I looked at the policies for the other districts, actually my colleague in Osseo did a lot of this work for me, so I was able to use her work and give her credit. But generally, districts in our size are in that 5 to 9% is what the school board policy is. I looked at one other source to consider, and this is the Government Finance Officers Association. I just quoted them, and it says, "It is recommended that governments, regardless of size, maintain unrestricted budgetary fund balance in their general fund of no less than 2 months." So this would be about 16.7% of the regular general fund operating revenues or regular fund operating expenditures. You could measure it on either one of those two. And this is new information that I didn't get into the text of the document if you were to look on board docs, because this came in on Friday. This was from our most recent S&P Global credit rating report. The district is assigned a AA rating, which is basically the third from the top. There's only 2 notches above AA+ or AAA. But here are a couple of comments they wrote specifically about the Rochester Public Schools fund balance in the general fund. They said, we could raise the rating if the district realizes sustained growth in reserves to a level that we consider very strong, and the district's economic metrics improve such that the overall credit profile resembles that of higher rated peers. A lot of words there, but basically saying if the fund balance were to go up to a higher percentage, it's possible they would consider bumping up our rating, assuming none of the other factors that they look at are declining either. And then they said we could lower the rating if the district's expenses consistently outpace the revenues or reserves fall below the district's fund balance policy of 6%, demonstrating an overall decline in financial performance. So they know that we're at 12.5% at the end of last year. So if they saw us drop all of a sudden to 6 or less than 6, that would be a concern to them that something's going wrong here. As we are doing budget planning, we're assuming if the budget were fully expended, we would end at 10.3% at the end of this year. And as we talked about a budget roadmap for the next 3 years, we've intentionally kind of said we want to maintain about 8% or more. We want to have a little bit more cushion than running our reserve right down to the board policy minimum. We just think that that's prudent in case something happens beyond our control. So at this point, our recommendation is basically, I think that policy 714 should go to the school board policy committee. So we kind of follow the normal chain of command and let the school board policy committee review this, and then consider if they want to recommend a change to either increasing it, they could decrease it too, but we'd probably hedge towards increasing it just slightly. And then if they desire, they can bring that back for a recommendation to the full board.
Okay, Ms. Workman.
Yes, could you tell us what the dollar amount is for each 1%, roughly?
So if our budget's about $250 million, 1% is about $2.5 million.
Thank you.
Ms. Amundson.
So I remember quite clearly when we needed our reserve when the state didn't, when they pushed our payments down the road. Could you just talk about that a little bit so that the other public and other board members and stuff?
Yeah, when I was talking back about one of the reasons why you keep cash, that was assuming even that because the state pays 90% in a year and then 10% the following year. Back in about 2011, it got shifted, I think, as low as 60-40. So they basically withheld an extra 30% for a couple months there so that the state books could be balanced and look good for year end, meaning they had enough fund balance. And then they worked to restore that. It took about 2 to 3 years of.
And could you talk about what other districts who didn't have the reserve experience?
Sure. Some districts had to go out and borrow money. They had to literally apply for a bank loan to make payroll and to keep their operations. Rochester did not have to do that. We didn't seek any additional funding. We had enough reserve. They were able to manage those payroll and bills that were due.
And if they are having to apply for a loan and pay interest back on that loan, that's going to adversely affect their general fund, actually causing them potentially to have to make budget cuts just because the state shifted the payments.
That's right. They would need to consider, one, paying the interest. That's a cost that comes out of something. And then, of course, maybe cut the budget, cut spending so that they're able to maintain to whatever level they could.
And the credit rating would go down.
And your credit rating is probably going to go down when you're.
So the districts that could least afford that budget shift, the payment shifting that happened, were the ones that were impacted adversely the most.
Correct.
So it'd be wise of us to avoid
It is a
that.
wise idea to have some level of reserve. I don't think it needs to be ridiculous because generally we can count on those state aid payments and generally count on the property tax payments coming in time, especially when this outlook looks reasonable right now. The state has a surplus, but that doesn't mean that's going to stay that way forever. We probably would have said that 3-4 years ahead of that everything seems like it'll be fine.
And we're hearing inflation and we're hearing recession. And as my memory serves me, the district has had in the past the AA+, and possibly did we have a AAA rating many years ago? I look at Ms. Severson because.
I don't recall the AAA, but I
Okay.
definitely know we were at AA+, and then we took a knock down when those fund balances were going down and we were overspending the revenues that were coming in for a period of a few years in a row
How
there.
long does it take to get that rating back up then once we make corrections to
Well,
their?
that's an interesting conversation, and maybe Jody can weigh in on that when we talk to her in a couple items down the road here, but it's kind of one of those things that seems like it's a little bit of a moving target, where it's like, if you have a couple years, well, if you have 3, well, now we've had 4 good positive years, and it hasn't quite moved yet, so.
And is that the kind of thing that we'd want to factor in when we know we might be taking out larger amounts in bonds? Like if we were, and we're not, but if we were to have a projected building need again, is that something we'd want to be thinking about to save money?
For
with large
sure.
expenditures?
And beyond that, we also have a long-term capital plan where we're issuing bonds every couple years already for our long-term facility maintenance projects. So we want to keep our rating as high as we can, to keep interest in our bonds and to keep the interest that we're being charged as low as possible.
Mr. Carlson, you provided us with a recommendation, not a resolution. So I'm wondering at this time if the board can come to a consensus that we would like to direct the policy committee to go back to policy 714 and look at changing that number. Then when they come back with that policy, at that point, you could rejoin us for the discussion about whether or not we want to accept the resolution.
That's perfectly okay with me.
Okay.
As a member of the policy committee, though, we would need to land on some kind of a number. Are you giving us multiple choices?
I think,
Go ahead.
I think
Jane,
in the
what do you
background,
wanna say?
we recommend that 8.3%, or just to signify about 1 month of reserve is the recommendation.
So in your information here, you're saying 8% plus, or at one point about 8.3%.
Maybe for ease, it's easier to round off and just make it 8% even, but.
Is there consensus that we'd like the policy committee to go ahead and develop that and bring it back to the board? I'm not seeing anybody objecting vehemently, so.
And we'll
Chair
take,
Marvin, I did have one kind of unrelated question that I'm just burning to ask, though. Can I do that?
Okay,
Are we done
sure.
with this part?
well, can I ask one, can I clarify one thing
go
about the
first.
policy process, then we
Oh,
can put
sure.
it to bed? So we will take it up at our May 5th meeting, and Mr. Carlson, you're invited to join us.
Okay, I am busy that day, I do know that off the top of my head.
Yeah,
It's
Kathy,
really this short of a line in policy.
that's
so
his
better.
story. He's sticking
Just
to it. He's
call
busy
Right,
that day,
right.
yeah.
We'll phone you in.
Okay.
I just have the fund balance categories all make sense to me except non-spendable. Can you give an example of a non-spendable?
A non-spendable is very limited. There's only a couple reasons. The one that comes to mind most often is, say somebody's registering for a conference for next year at this point, so it's going to happen in August. We pay that bill now. At the end of the year, we have to count that as a non-spendable thing because it's against our books already. We've already basically paid for that conference. We aren't getting the money back at that point.
Small percentage of what we do.
Very small percentage of our year-end balances.
Thank you.
Mr. Carlson, thank you for your information, and Policy Committee, thank you in advance for the work that you're going to be doing. Appreciate that. Then we'll move on to 8.01 and 8.02, Policy Recommendations and Procedure Recommendations. And we'll turn this over to our Policy and Procedure Committee.
Thank you, Chair Marvin. I think we got some feedback at the School Board Academy about this section of our agenda, so I'm going to take the opportunity for the public who may be watching, that these policy recommendations are included in our agendas for 3 meetings. They're briefed twice, and then they're voted on at the 3rd subsequent meeting. And this is a cycle of policy review that happens over a 3-year period, and we have the policies assigned based on the last day that they were approved by the board. And in general, the process is that the policy committee meets monthly, and we have a set of policies to review. We look at MSBA recommended changes, and we also consult with the cabinet and the superintendent about other operating practices that are happening in the district that should be reflected in the policy. And so what you're hearing from us tonight is a summary of what each of the policies are, and then a brief identification of either the sources of the changes or the nature of the changes. In general, if it's a policy like the fund balance policy that we just went through that has a significant change or a significant impact, we would bring it to the board as a standalone agenda item, and we have some of those planned for upcoming. So in this section of the meeting, these are really part of our 3-year annual review that just keeps us in compliance with making sure we're staying up to date with policies. And I guess I'm first. Policy 20305, School Board Meeting Agenda. The purpose of this policy is to provide the process for the preparation of the school board meeting agenda to ensure that the school board can accomplish its business as efficiently and expeditiously as possible, and the updates here are reflecting changes in MSBA model policy. Policy 205 is open meetings and closed meetings. The purpose of this policy is to provide guidelines to assure the rights of the public to be present at school board meetings, while also protecting an individual's right to privacy under law, and to close meetings when the public interest so requires as recognized by law. Again, updates to reflect changes in MSBA model policy. Policy 208, Development, Adoption, and Implementation of Policies. Personally, my favorite one. The purpose of this policy is to emphasize the importance of the policy-making role of the school board and provide the means for it to be an ongoing effort. Updates to reflect MSBA model policy.
Policy 209, the Code of Ethics. The purpose of this policy is to assist individual school board members in understanding their role as part of a school board and in recognizing the contribution that each member must make to develop an effective and responsible school board. These were updates from the annual review. Policy 210, Conflict of Interest, School Board Meetings. The purpose of this policy is to observe state statutes regarding conflict of interest and to engage in district business activities in a fashion designed to avoid any conflict of interest or the appearance of impropriety.
And policy 211, which is called criminal or civil action against the district, school board member, employee, or student. The purpose of this policy is to provide guidance about the district's position, rights, and responsibilities when a civil or criminal action is pending against the district, a school board member, a district employee, or a student. Those updates were a result of MSBA model policy change. We have policy 250, which is legal counsel. The purpose being to provide guidelines for obtaining legal counsel for the school district, and the updates were a result of clarifications needed. Policy 504, which is student dress and appearance. The purpose is to enhance the education of students by establishing expectations of dress and grooming that are related to educational goals and community standards. And again, the updates were to reflect MSBA model policy as well as a result of our annual reviewing of it.
Policy 506, Student Discipline. All students have the right to obtain an education and the right to learn. The purpose of this policy is to set forth the school board's expectations for student behavior and to set forth procedures for the superintendent and school district administration to establish guidelines for the manner in which the expectations outlined in this policy will be enforced. And this is updates from annual review. And if I could just say for a minute, there are some policies that we are required to review annually and not on the 3-year cycle, so that's why in this case we're looking at a lot of our annual review policies. Policy 514, Bullying Prohibition. The purpose of this policy is to assist the school district in preventing and responding to acts of bullying, intimidation, violence, reprisal, retaliation, and other similar disruptive and detrimental behavior. Updates reflect MSBA model policy changes in annual review. And the Internet Acceptable Use and Safety Policy. The purpose of this policy is to establish requirements, expectations, and guidelines for access to the use of electronic technology. And these are updates from our annual review.
Policy 613, Graduation Requirements. The purpose of this policy is to set forth requirements for graduation from the school district. These updates reflect MSBA model policy. 613.01, Participation in the Graduation Ceremony. The purpose of this policy is to establish the criteria for participation in the graduation ceremony, and there were updates to incorporate language from procedure into policy.
And policy 806, Crisis Management. The purpose is to act as a guide for school district and building administrators, school employees, students, school board members, and community members as to how to address a wide range of potential crisis situations in the school district. The step-by-step procedures suggested by this policy will provide guidance to each school building in drafting crisis management plans. to coordinate protective actions prior to, during, and after any type of emergency or potential crisis situation. The updates were a result of our annually reviewing this policy.
And we had one policy with no changes recommended, Policy 212, School Board Member Development. The purpose of this policy is to set expectations for the members of the school board to participate in professional development activities designed for them so that they may perform their responsibilities as efficiently and effectively as possible.
Go
No
on to
changes.
Procedures.
Go ahead.
So Procedure 209, the Code of Ethics, the purpose of these procedures is to provide guidelines and internal support systems to promote the professional behaviors of school board members within the School Board Code of Ethics. There were updates to correct position titles and remove outdated language. Procedure 504A, Student Dress and Appearance. The purpose of this procedure is to enhance the education of students by establishing expectations of dress and grooming that are related to educational goals and community standards. Updates reflect the procedure in the MSBA model policy. And finally, Procedure 613.1A, criteria for participation in graduation ceremonies. We are recommending the retirement of this policy. The criteria for participation in graduation ceremonies are to serve as consistent guidelines for high school graduation activities. Language from this procedure were incorporated into Policy 613.1.
And that was your first briefing.
That was great.
Can't wait for the next one.
The good news is for the second and third, we don't have to read them again.
But you could if you wanted to.
And board members are always welcome to read them all in detail, just in case there's something in there that you would like to comment on.
Great, thank you. We'll move to 9.01, acceptance of proposals for the sale and issuance of full-term certificates of participation, Series 2022B.
Dr. Marvin and directors of the board, I am pleased to ask John Carlson to come back to join us and introduce his colleague.
All right, thank you again. I have Jody Zespa here from Ellers today, and she's going to update us on the bond sales that were held this morning and certificate sales that were held. We're going to start with the certificates first, and then we'll have you vote on that, and then we'll move to the second one after that.
Great, thank you, John, and good evening. So we're starting with the one where we have a little better news than the second one. As you know, interest rates have been increasing, so we're a little concerned about how things might turn out today, but in fact, things turned out pretty well. So with the first sale, the certificates of participation, these are financing technology equipment for instructional use, and you access this funding every 2 to 3 years. The ratings that you received were the AAA under the Minnesota State Credit Enhancement Program. So that's a program that you participate in free of charge, and the state then guarantees the payment of your debt payment should you not be able to make them. So that gets the highest rating under the Standard & Poor's rating system. Your underlying rating, as John mentioned, was affirmed at a AA. And John and 2 of his team members participated in the call with the rating agency again. Once again, no surprise. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that he was very prepared, very organized, able to answer all of their questions, and that really helps as part of the process. So we appreciate that very much, and just very helpful again. In terms of what might make that rating go up and how long a period of time, that was a question that you asked a little while ago. We've been hearing from them a 3 to 5 year term, and I think prior to the pandemic, you guys were really on the edge of potentially getting back up to that AA+, and then they've really been kind of watching enrollment. So enrollment for all districts has been a little bit of a challenge, and I think things are starting to settle back in now again. So we'll keep in communication with them. Even if you're not issuing bonds or debt, they do monitor your financial condition, especially each year as you send your audit into them, and they can initiate a process with us to review your rating, so it doesn't have to be as part of a debt transaction. So they'll continue to watch you, and we'll certainly look forward to the day when we can report that news again to you. So with respect to this issue, we did get 3 bids. This is a smaller issue, pretty short, just 3 maturities.
The low bid that we received was a 2.31%, and if you look in the notes at the bottom of that first page, that is lower than what we were expecting back in February. And with rates increasing so much, we weren't sure we would be able to meet that percent. In fact, we had John prepared for something a little closer to 3. So when the bids came in, we were really excited to see that result. So in terms of the payments over the life of this issue, there will be about $34,000 less. If you turn to then the attachments, the first attachment is the bid tab, and the bids that you received were from Bach Financial Securities out of Milwaukee. They were the low bidder at about 2.32%. JP Morgan out of New York, very closely behind at a 2.37%, and then Piper Sandler here in Minneapolis at a 2.38%. So we do like to see at least 3 bids, so we are happy to see 3 bids on this issue. The next couple of pages then are the same schedules that you saw in your pre-sale report when Greg Crow was here to present those to you on March 22nd. So those are now just updated for the final sale results. So in terms of the sources and uses, we just make sure that we have sufficient funds to cover the projects that MDE approved on your behalf, because there was an approval process that you went through last summer prior to setting the levy. And then if you look at the payment schedule on attachments page 3, the first year's payments, 22, 23, are already included in your levy for taxes payable in 22. So we were just trying to get as close as possible to the amount that you included in your levy. And that's everything on the 2022 B certificates.
Any questions, board members?
Just a little curiosity one that you mentioned enrollment effects. So have other districts been changed? I mean, they've been pretty much not changing their ratings either, because we know it's a volatile situation. But the AA is better than a lot of districts?
Oh, yes. So there's only 2 districts in the state that have a AAA rating, and you could probably guess who they are. Why is that? I need Dinah. And then there are maybe just a handful that are at the AA plus. So there are not very many school districts in the whole state that have a higher rating than you.
Right, and so I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we were doing great.
Yes,
It's just we're always
absolutely.
looking to do better.
Absolutely.
This is a briefing item.
Okay, action.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to move this to action. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's now an action item. Be it resolved, the School Board of Independent School District 535 does hereby authorize the lease purchase of district equipment, providing for the financing thereof, and issuance of certificates of participation with respect thereto, and approving and authorizing the execution of documentation relating thereto is provided in attachments B, C, and D.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. And then 9.02, acceptance of proposals for the sale and issuance of general obligation facilities maintenance bonds, Series 2022A.
All right, this is the second one. This is for the facility maintenance bonds. So these are for long-term facility maintenance projects that are within our 10-year long-term facility maintenance plan. Take it away, Jody.
All right, great. I'll just make a few overall comments. So these bonds are issued as part of the Long-Term Facilities Maintenance Program. That program used to be called the Alternative Facilities Program for you. So that program's been in place for about 25 years. It allows you to access funds to finance state-approved deferred maintenance and health and safety projects, basically so that you can protect the investment that the community already has in your facilities. So it's not doing anything new. It's really just taking care of the projects that you have in the deferred maintenance projects and keeping a nice, safe learning environment for your staff and students. So the way that your long-term facilities maintenance projects are financed, there's 3 sources. You do qualify for some state aid, which is great, because you don't qualify for state aid in all funding formulas, but you do in this formula. You also levy annual property tax levies, and then you issue bonds. And generally, we've been issuing bonds to finance projects on a 2-year basis. That's what the state will allow, and then that allows you to save a little bit on cost of issuance. So that is how they get financed, and we do have a planning tool, and we'll show you a little bit. You've seen those schedules from us in the past, but that allows you to, as we finance through those 3 sources, to keep a nice level tax rate. So that's our goal as we work with financing these projects. So turning to the first page of this, again, you're financing health and safety projects as part of this particular bond issue, I think primarily at John Marshall.
And then I think Kellogg and Mayo are coming up in the plan too within the next couple summers. So.
Got it. So the ratings that were assigned were the same, the AAA under the State Credit Enhancement Program, the AA underlying rating. You received 11 bids. So that was very exciting for us to see. So this is a really, really attractive bond sale in the market today. And we'll go through the list of bidders in just a minute, but the low bidder was Citigroup out of Los Angeles, California, at about a 3.32% rate. So we didn't get under the estimate that we had for when we put together the estimates back in March. But again, all things considered, 3% rate is nothing to sneeze at. So we're happy with those results. We were expecting to be a little above 3 when we talked to John earlier today based upon recent sales. So we came in about where we expected to be. So you'll see on the second page there, even though the total principal and interest are be a little bit higher than our pre-sale estimates, we do structure the bonds in a way so that we don't increase the property tax rate on your debt service levies, and we'll show you how that works in just a minute. So the levies for the first payments on the bonds will coincide then with the tax rate that you have in place right now for your debt and capital levies. So the attachments to this report include the bid tabulation, which is very lengthy. So Citigroup out of Los Angeles, again, the low bidder, with RBC Capital Markets out of New York, very closely behind at a 3.34% rate, basically. And then you receive bids from Bach, again, out of Milwaukee, KeyBank out of Cleveland, Ohio, JP Morgan out of New York, Raymond James out of St. Petersburg, Florida, Wells Fargo out of Charlotte, North Carolina, Bank of America out of New York, Piper Sandler, again, Minneapolis, Baird out of Red Bank, New Jersey, and Hilltop from Dallas, Texas. So you got bids literally from throughout the country. So really exciting to see that much interest in the bonds that you presented to the market today. Again, the schedules that are attached are updates to what was presented in March. So first, our sources and uses schedule, again, making sure that we have sufficient funds to cover the projects that were approved by the state and included in your 10-year plan. The detailed debt schedule is on page 4. Our detailed long-term financing plan, that's in about size 4 font, where all the magic happens, is on page 5. I won't read all of those numbers to you, but I think it's important then to see the chart that follows that on page 6, which shows that nice level debt service tax rate with some step downs in the future to provide you with some capacity and flexibility as you address projects over time. The next schedule shows the volatility in the municipal bond market recently. So that's BBI index that you see charted there with some nice historic low levels during kind of the years of the pandemic and then increasing pretty dramatically over the last few months. And then the rating report we attached to this sale day report, but it does apply to both of the issues tonight. So you'll see some background information about the State Credit Enhancement Program, a little bit of information about each of the debt issues, and then more specific information about the district. And I'll also point out on page 5, there's a nice section there about the forward-looking management team with good financial management assessment. So again, thanks to you, to John, to everyone throughout the district who works so hard to keep your finances in good shape.
Melissa?
So the discrepancy between the interest rates of the two sales, is that because the second one is considered more risky? Is it based on the length of the bond?
It's the length.
The
Yep.
length,
So
okay.
the certificates of participation get repaid over 3-year term. So similar to like a home mortgage, if you were just getting a home mortgage for 3 years, you'd get a much lower rate than if you had a 17-year. So that is the discrepancy, or the difference is really just due to the term.
Thank you.
Because the ratings are exactly the same. They're both general obligation debt. So both the same ratings. The facilities maintenance bonds are general obligation debt in addition to that. So.
Thank you.
Other questions? I'd love for someone to move this to action.
Move to action.
Second.
It's been moved to action and seconded a lot. All in favor of moving it to action, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's now an action item. Be it resolved, the School Board of Independent School District 535 does hereby authorize the issuance, awarding the sale, prescribing the form and details, providing the payment of $49,120,000 General Obligation Facilities Maintenance Bonds, Series 2022A, and authorizes the execution of documentation relating thereto as provided in Attachment B.
Move approval. Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you so much for your expertise and for your enthusiasm after waiting for 2 hours, really.
Thank
you.
I'm a night owl, so this is a good
Well,
time of.
No,
good
this
time
is
of day
above
for
and
me.
beyond, and the information you provided the board ahead of time is just, it's really impressive. Thank you
very
again.
much. Yeah, we really appreciate the opportunity to be of service to you once again, and it was great to work with the team also. So thanks again. We do have proposal forms that need to be signed, and I'll bring those back with me later, so I can either wait or whatever works best.
Okay.
Do you need signatures now?
Just chair and clerk.
Oh,
I can just hand them to you guys. And
okay. And while we're doing that, 9.03 School Resource Office Memorandum of Understanding. Dr. Piquel.
Dr. Marvin and directors of the board, we, as you know, have a contract with Rochester Police Department to provide school resource officer services. We have a deadline of May 1st to either change, discontinue, or continue that contract. And we've had a subgroup of board members who have joined with a group of staff to develop changes to that contract. We've shared those changes with Rochester Police Department. They are in the midst of considering them. I'll say have had mostly very favorable responses. But we need a bit more time in order to get to, I think, the positive conclusion that I am hopeful we can get to. And so we are putting this resolution before you that would provide us with additional time. And I believe, Madam Chair, that we are going to actually hope to extend what is in the original resolution to June 30th, which would give us through June to be sure that we have enough time to conclude the negotiations with Rochester Police Department without rolling over the contract, because it automatically extends if we take no action. And so that is the background on this item.
Any questions or comments? I know 3 of you have been working hard on the contract. Appreciate that work.
I would appreciate the extra time, so the 30th versus the 1st.
Do we need to make a formal amendment?
I'm just going to read I'll just read the resolution. If it gets moved to action, I'll read the resolution with the changed date. If we get it moved to action.
Oh, move to action.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to move this to action. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? I will now read the resolution, and the date's going to be changed from what you may have on your screen. Be it resolved, School Board of Independent School District 535 does hereby approve the Memorandum of Understanding for the School Resource Officer contract that extends the May 1 deadline for providing notification of termination of the contract to June 30th for this contract year.
Move approval. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. We will then move to 9.04, approval of construction costs for a roundabout at Harriet Bishop Elementary School. Dr. Piquel.
Dr. Marvin, directors of the board, I am pleased to ask Scott Sheridan, who's our Executive Director of Operations, to come up and give the board a quick overview of this opportunity and answer any questions as we are asking for your approval.
Good evening, board members.
Good evening.
It's kind of dramatic.
Would you like the dramatic pause?
It's a tradition. It's a tradition, yeah.
Pretty good, isn't it? I'm planning that all night. Well, just a quick background for you to consider. On May 4th of 2021, the school board approved the agreement for relocation of a traffic control signal and construction of a mini roundabout at the intersection of 36th Avenue and 4th Place Northwest. This was an agreement that we co-authored with the city of Rochester. Well, we're now to the point where we hired WSB architects to design it. You've been provided an example of what the roundabout will look like. And we're now to the point where we need to get approval to move forward with the project so that we can get it completed by the start of school. We did a change order with Rochester Sand and Gravel. This is the company that was contracted to do all the parking lot work, the school bus turnaround work at the school. So it's just a change order for have them to do the roundabout as well, since they've mobilized all their equipment. It's all on site. It's easy for them just to do. We got a bid back from them for the project was $253,310.04. I know how we love that, 4 cents. But our half of it, the city has agreed to pay for half that, but we have to pay for it up front, and then we ask for reimbursement when the project is done from the city, and they'll pay us back our $126,655, and we'll insist on the 2 cents as well. So we're here to get approval of the funding for Rochester Sand and Gravel to do the project.
Questions or comments? Ms. Workman?
I have a quick question. Is that just a kind of a verbal agreement, or do we actually have a contract for the reimbursement from the city?
We have a contract
Okay,
with them.
thank you.
You couldn't talk them out of the 2 cents?
They're not aware of the 2 cents yet.
That might be a deal breaker, huh?
Move to action.
Thank you.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to move this to action. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's an action item. Be it resolved, School Board of Independent School District 535 does hereby approve the change order to Rochester Sand and Gravel in the amount of $253,310.04 for the construction of the mini roundabout at the intersection of 36th Avenue Northwest and 4th Place Northwest with the City of Rochester contingent upon City Council approval of the same agreement.
Move approval.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
9.05, approval of the budget for musical instruments for Dakota Middle School and Overland Elementary School. Dr. Piquel.
Dr. Marvin, directors of the board, I don't know that we have a presentation on this item, but Brenda Wichman, our Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction, is certainly here to help me answer any questions. But as you know, we're opening new schools, and that brings lots of needs, including musical instruments. And so you have before you the request for approval to purchase musical instruments for Dakota Middle School and Overland Elementary.
Any questions for Ms. Wichman? Where are those kids with the ukuleles when we need them? No.
Give them all
Jackie,
the
you're not
instruments.
Are there
saying-
ukuleles in this budget?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay,
ukuleles
good.
are in the budget, so
Ella.
that should sway any
Well,
votes.
then,
This
I
is
was more
move-
swayed by the 30 cellos. That seemed really
Yeah.
cool.
Cellos.
30 cellos.
Then move to action if the
Thank you.
ukuleles are
Excellent.
included.
It's been moved and
Enthusiastically
seconded to move this to
thirded.
action. Wow. Be it resolved, School Board of Independent School District 535 does hereby approve the purchase of musical instruments from Music Mart in the amount of $197,678.23.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. And our last item this evening, 9.06, procedure recommendation. Procedure 206A, time, place, and manner restrictions and procedures for public school board meetings and comments to the board. Ms. Nathan, you did a great job of writing this up. Do you want to walk us through it? Okay.
So as I mentioned, if it's a change to a policy or procedure outside of our regular review that we feel that the board needs to have special consideration, we'll bring it as a separate item, which is what we're doing with this tonight. Right now, the deadline to sign up to provide comments to the board is 3:00 PM on the day of the meeting, and we are recommending to change it to 5:00 PM on the day before the meeting. We've received some feedback from our assistant board clerk that that 3:00 deadline does not give her enough time to get in touch with the speakers who are coming to provide comments to the board. Oftentimes, the individuals who want to sign up for comments to the board either send her an email or they leave a voicemail message, and then she goes back to contact them to make sure all their information is accurate, give instructions as to when to arrive, what order they might be in, find out if they have any specific accessibility needs. And I don't know if you saw her before this meeting, but she was bustling about making sure that our meetings are effective and efficient, and that 2 hours between 3:00 and when our meeting starts just doesn't give her the time to follow up. So she made the recommendation to us that it be changed to 5:00 PM on the day before the meeting, which gives her the whole day on Tuesday to then prepare for those comments to the board.
Ms. Amundson?
Is there a reason we chose 5 instead of like 10 PM or midnight in case people are getting home from work and thinking about it before they go to bed? Or is it just so it's waiting, the request is waiting first thing in the morning and you can get to it that morning?
And that was actually my suggestion. It's the end of the workday. And certainly, if people have ideas or questions that come up at the last minute, they can call, they can send an email, they can contact the board. It's just to have them, board members are expected to be ready a week ahead for the meeting. That's when we get our information. We have speakers who come in, and we try to give them a window about when we can anticipate that they will be speaking. So if we have, 8 people who sign up at 11 PM on Monday night, it makes it tougher. And I'm thinking the end of the workday on Monday is fine. They can always sign up to speak at the next meeting, and of course, they can contact the board individually or as a group. But beyond that, it was relatively arbitrary.
I think 5 o'clock is reasonable for the reasons you outlined. I mean, if that was the only means of communication that people had, then I would be more inclined to go with Ms. Amundson's recommendation or suggestion, but.
It's just a question.
A question.
A question as to the logic. I was just wondering if it was arbitrary.
And it's a good question. It's a good question. Mr. Barlow?
Well, I'd like to actually speak in favor of allowing it to remain as it currently is. Having been a member of the community, and some of you as current board members have stood before the board to testify during the public comment period. And as a local pastor, sometimes I wouldn't be made aware of a concern that a parent or a staff member had until maybe later in the day of Monday. The current policy does allow full access, which I think we're encouraging that, and we're saying we're not trying to eliminate that, but I support the policy as it is currently written, allowing 3 PM on the day of the school board to be the standard.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just like to ask Ms. Severson, who would be most directly affected by this, what is recommended is your preference? Or would there be a change?
You were the one who brought it, right? Or asked?
So you are asking for
Monday night.
the day before 5 PM?
Yes, I'm willing to support whatever this board decides.
Of course you are.
It's my job to support the board, and whatever time frame you give me is the time frame that I'll be happy to work with.
And I'm here early for every board meeting. And Ms. Severson, you are possibly the nicest human being I've ever known. But it can get to be a real circus with people coming in and the changes that happen. It's very stressful. And certainly it's not a deal breaker, but Don, I appreciate your point. Because sometimes things do come up at the last minute, but there is no reason that someone who decides at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday that there's something they want the board to know, they can send an email and they can absolutely speak to the entire board at the next meeting. But
And I would say too, like, it doesn't necessarily affect us whenever the person shows up. I mean, you are the most directly affected by that. So it might extend our meeting time, but it's not like we necessarily know that before it's happening anyway. If you're asking for this, I would be in favor of it if it's going to make your life easier and you're supporting us, and I would support you in this recognition. I don't necessarily have issue. And I think, Dr. Marvin, you bring up good points as well. And I would also imagine you could make a concession, like if there's no one scheduled to speak and they're contacting you at 3 PM the day of the meeting and you have the time to, accommodate,
well, the thing is, when it's a procedure, it's a procedure. And so it's kind of like, here's the rule. Melissa.
I saw Kathy's finger. Did you want to go first?
Sure. So I think some of the things that we're doing that still support public engagement with the board is, working to put our annual calendar out there on a weekly basis. So if a member of the community is particularly interested in a topic that is going to come before the board, the community can search that calendar and find it, and you could know 6 months ahead of time that we're going to be discussing a certain topic, or when the discipline data is coming back, or whatever might be of interest. So we've really worked hard this year to give the public far advance notice of when topics are happening. In addition, I think we're working about getting that agenda out to the board a week ahead of time, and then we have our public notice that complies with state law, but that information is available on board docs. They don't have to be making a game time last minute decision, whether or not there's a topic that they want to speak of. And those are my points.
So since we have a variety of opinions on this, I'm wondering if there couldn't be some kind of a compromise that would both give Ms. Severson more time, but based on a time that fits Ms. Severson's schedule. Because if you aren't considering working on it between like 5 p.m. and 10 p.m. or midnight, it seems to me that we're artificially restricting that window. So I guess, all I'm doing is saying, is there something that would still benefit you that could be a compromise from what was proposed?
If I may, my job is to serve the board.
Yes.
The board's job is to make the decisions on behalf of the board. And whether it's me in this position or anyone else, your decisions to serve this community are the most important decisions. I do think that that this board has made greater effort to get communications out there in a more consistent way. I think we're much better at that than when I started a year ago. I will also say that one of the most underutilized forms of communication with the board is that by law, if you request to be put on to receive the school board agendas, if you request that with me, you can get that notice directly emailed to you at any time. So I would say, in response to that, regardless of what the time is, if there are interested members in this community who want to stay on top of that information and want to receive our draft agendas on notice, please contact me directly, and we can certainly get that information to people individually earlier.
Yes.
I sort of see both sides of this, and I'm wondering if I kind of want to give an example to perhaps give some context here. I heard what Director Barlow's saying is it's not something necessarily on the agenda, but it's something that might happen in the community. And the example I'm thinking back to in the last year is the government speech issue, that something happened at the schools and people were upset about it and perhaps wanted to tell us what they thought a few days after it happened. And that this may restrict that from happening and putting it out a 2-week time period that would lose the effectiveness of that communication. So my thought is that perhaps, and I encountered this morning in my own life, that I was encountered with a procedure at City Hall, and the response I got is that the person I was talking to could give one grace of what, changing or deferring from the policy because she could. And I would like to see Clerk Severson have that authority. If she's okay with a last minute ad, under the circumstances, we would empower her to make that decision if it fits within her schedule, if that's a workable process.
And I think that's a lovely thought, but I think we're going to be undermining every procedure we have. If it's, here's the procedure, except if somebody decides we're not going to follow it. I absolutely understand what you say. And again, if something dire happens, anyone can contact any or all board members at any time. The issue is having people come and sit at that table and speak to the board. Our agendas are set up well in advance, and I think we need to know who's going to be here, how many people are going to be here, and then stick to that. Now, this is not, I didn't think this was going to be a big issue at all.
I didn't either. I think it's kind of weird, to be honest. And
I do too.
You know, someone is requesting assistance and accommodation, and I don't know why that has become an issue. The thing that I'm thinking of, like maybe what Director McLaughlin was getting at, and to my earlier point, is that if we were to call an emergency meeting, right, so like we're not giving that full notice, like we need to do something right now, might there be the opportunity, like in X circumstance, why wouldn't we do that if we can do it ourselves? Like if we're going to call a meeting within, you know, open meeting law, but we have to do it today, why wouldn't we allow somebody 3 p.m. on that day to come speak to us? So if we had some calamity, why wouldn't that be an option?
Do you want to table this and come back to it?
I was just going to say that. Can we, it wouldn't be tabling, it would be postponing to a definite date, correct?
Yes.
Well,
Why?
Why? Right.
What is the
To allow
problem?
the community time to weigh in. This is a change in procedure that will primarily affect the community. The community should be allowed to express their opinion.
Well, I'm just wondering if somebody has a time in mind that isn't 5 o'clock the night before and is between 5 o'clock the night before and 3 o'clock of the day of, does anybody have a better time that they're thinking? Because we're certainly not going to take a survey of the community to find out what time works best for you. Because
You
I
think
think
we'd have consensus on that?
I'm sure we'd get consensus on that. But I mean, is there a thought that someone has that you're moving toward to be more accommodating to the community?
We're talking like 11:59 on that day
Right.
versus 5, like the end of the actual day rather than the business
Right.
day.
Well, Chair Marvin, I certainly don't want to invest more time. I'll simply comment. Certainly, my concern is more so directed toward accommodating the community and not, if you will, disservicing our assistant board clerk. Yeah, I want that to be clear. But I also would acknowledge that we are doing a fairly good job in availing ourselves to towards the community. And just as we tonight are proposing a change, if we approve this and we discover it isn't working as we envisioned, we could possibly revisit it. So I will
Move it to action.
actually say that I now support the a procedural change and would recommend this be moved to action.
I second
Thank you.
it.
I didn't mean to put words in your mouth.
No
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. All right, this is all in favor of moving this to action, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Hey,
Right, it's an action item. Be it resolved, the School Board of Independent School District 535 accept the recommended changes to Procedure 206A, time, place, and manner restrictions and procedures for public school board meetings and comments to the board.
Move approval.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. And again, if it's not working, we can certainly revisit it. Are there other items? You have the revised annual calendar update. And are there other items that you would like to be considered on a future agenda? Hearing none. It is 8:08 p.m. and we are adjourned.
Good job.